All right, so you guys remember that story, the screams without words. You can see it here, but they have their fucking paywall up, where they went through and wrote the most insane story accusing Hamas, the Palestinian resistance, of widespread sexual violence on October 7th. Now, you'll remember that after this happened, a bunch of mainstream media hacks. Now, you'll remember after this happened, a bunch of people in mainstream media, including huge figures like Hillary Clinton, went out to repeat this. So, the way that this works is you launder some propaganda into the media, and then you use that propaganda that was laundered into the media as evidence for your claims. So there doesn't need to actually be evidence. There can just be a story. And then if that story is printed in the New York Times, you can cite that as your so-called evidence. So I'm obviously not going through this payroll, but needless to say, so that story was out and people were repeating it over and over and over again, despite the fact that the story itself doesn't provide any evidence. All it is emotion and claims of we heard things and people really felt this way, but the story itself provided zero evidence. Now that this has been more under scrutiny, one of the people on the byline, a journalist, but not really a journalist, as you'll see, is being investigated because why was she on this piece? Okay, so let's watch this piece by Krystal Ball. It's really, really good, and it breaks it down, and we'll go through it together.
IDF intelligence unit, a massive scandal is developing at the New York Times, where it has now been revealed that the co-author of a discredited article on rape on October 7th, liked genocidal posts on social media, is a former member of an IDF intelligence unit, and had not even worked as a journalist at all prior to taking on a central role in Times coverage. The Times is now investigating the journalist, a woman by the name of
Investigating.
But the questions about this incident go so far beyond this one journalist and her appreciation for psychopathic social media posts. So here is the backstory. On December 28th, the New York Times published and news alerted what appeared to be an extensive investigation into one of the most fraught and contested parts of the Israeli October 7th narrative, that sexual assault was used by Hamas systematically as a weapon of war on that day. The piece was headlined, Screams Without Words, How Hamas Weaponized Sexual Violence on October 7. The byline named three different authors, Jeffrey Gettleman, Anat Schwartz, and Adam Sella. Now, the fact that Hamas committed atrocities on October 7th is not in dispute. However, certain particularly horrifying anecdotes claimed by the Israeli government have fallen apart under scrutiny by Israeli outlet Haaretz. These debunked claims include that 40 babies were beheaded, that a baby was found in an oven, and that a pregnant woman had her baby cut out of her, among others. It is no accident, of course, that these stories were propagated. This agitprop about the barbarism of Hamas was crucial for Israel in their attempt to justify a barbaric assault on the Gaza Strip.
Exactly. So they say, oh, that Hamas committed atrocities is not in dispute. Okay, all of the things that made the news, the beheaded babies hoax, the hoax of a baby was cut out of a woman, mass rapes, those things were all hoaxes made up in order to justify the assault on Gaza. That propaganda was put out purposefully so that it would prep and prime the American people and the people around the world to say, whoa, look at what barbarians they are. Go get them. Go get them. But there was never any evidence for any of that. They didn't have evidence of the beheaded babies. They didn't have evidence of the woman who had a baby cut out of her. Also, they didn't have evidence and still don't have evidence of these supposed mass rapes. The October 7th attack was so widely recorded. There was video everywhere. There was surveillance video. It wasn't just a video on the GoPros from the Hamas militants. There was video everywhere. Video from the Israelis, video from the surveillance cameras because they live in a police state. Yet, there is no video of these supposed mass rapes. On top of that, there is no one who has come forward to say that they were a victim of that. Does no one else think that's weird? that there were all these mass rapes, but no one has come forward to say that I was one of those people, or I was one of those, or I knew personally one of those people because maybe they got killed afterward, or maybe that was my family member. Where are the photos? Where is the video? Where are even the firsthand accounts? None of these are firsthand accounts. They're all, I heard someone, heard someone, heard someone, heard someone. And then when the UN said, let's investigate it, because let's say that there was, I don't want to diminish if something like that happened. So let's say that there was. Why then, when the UN said, let's investigate that, Israel refused to cooperate? Okay, but continue.
So this piece, Screams Without Words, was published by the New York Times, purporting to back up Israeli assertions about widespread rape on October 7th. It was incredibly significant. But no sooner had the piece been published that major problems emerged. The family of a woman murdered by Hamas, who was presented as a central figure in the New York Times narrative about widespread rape, denounced the story in furious and unequivocal terms. They claimed that when the Times interviewed them about their murdered loved one, Gal Abdush, under false pretenses, the family said that they had no indication Gal had been raped, no evidence to support such claims, did not believe them to be true, and that they had no idea that the Times had planned to say that Gal had been raped. Multiple family members told the Israeli press that the media invented the story and demanded that they stop spreading lies. Gal's story comprised no less than 1/3 of the lengthy Times report. And that was really just the beginning of the problems with that report. Key witnesses were caught telling inconsistent stories to different news outlets. Screams Without Words had relied on the testimony of a volunteer with an ultra-Orthodox nonprofit called Zaka that had been caught fabricating some of the most visceral debunked anecdotes about October 7th, including that one about the 40 beheaded babies.
Okay, let's pause that for a second when she brought up Zaka. So, as I said a couple minutes ago, Zaka was this. So, as I said a couple seconds ago, Zaka was one of the sources that they were using to prop up these claims of mass rape. Listen to this thread by Z Squirrel, which is one of my favorite, probably my favorite account on Twitter. I love Squirrel gives a lot of information, and Squirrel was the one who really unearthed a lot of this. Breaking, Annette Schwartz, who expressed that she's a genocidal racist who wants to turn Gaza into a slaughterhouse, make propaganda for Western audiences that Hamas is ISIS because it's important for the Israeli Hezbollah, which she then did, says it's just about liking a post by mistake, of course. The New York Times and Annette Schwartz, Adam Sella, and Jeffrey Gettleman, who collaboratively fabricated the biggest hoax in New York Times history since Judith Miller, are desperately doing the most absurd, deranged damage control imaginable. Yeah, I just like the post by mistake, lol. Not only is that an obvious lie, it ignores her other social media activity, including her expressing she deliberately wanted to fabricate propaganda for Western audiences that Hamas is ISIS, and repeating the 40 beheaded babies hoax from Zaka, who became her own main source. So Zaka was the main source that they used in that propaganda piece of the New York Times. So it just begets more lies. It starts with one lie in one publication or one organization like Zaka, and then it continues to get laundered through different sources and through different journalists, all up until the point where it just becomes canon and truth. This is astonishing. After the New York Times gave Annette Schwartz and Adam Sella the job of being lead reporters, she describes not being able to find any evidence whatsoever of mass rape, and then she finally sees the light, the Zaka pedophile rape cult 40 beheaded babies hoaxers. It's not just that the Zaka pedophile rape cult who made up the 40 beheaded babies hoaxes. It's not just the Zaka pedophile rape cult who made up the 40 beheaded babies in ovens hoaxes that Annette Schwartz and Adam Sella used as their core evidence. It's also Sherry Mendez, the architect army volunteer who claimed that she saw a non-existent beheaded baby with her own eyes. She also confirmed that she expressed before the New York Times assigned her, Adam Sella and Jeffrey Gettleman, to collaboratively concoct the biggest hoax in New York Times history since Judith Miller laundered the WMD lie. It's important for Israeli propaganda. And then they link the report. We'll get to this report in a second, but I want to finish Krystal's expose.
And the Times itself, well, they appeared to lose confidence in the reporting. As our colleague Ryan Grimm, along with Daniel Boguslaw, reported for The Intercept, an episode of the New York Times flagship podcast, The Daily, had been planned to detail the reporting from the sexual assault piece, which had originally been much hyped by the New York Times newsroom.
Amazing.
But as the quote-unquote reporting in the piece fell apart, the Times was left with a major dilemma about what to do. Should they ignore the problems, stand by their shoddy reporting, and push out the Daily episode as recorded? Should they edit the Daily episode and attempt to correct the record, add caveats, and effectively admit the problems with that original report? Or should they take the coward's way out and just shelve the episode entirely? Now, a responsible outlet would either correct the original story or retract it, given the serious journalistic failings that have been brought to light. But the Times chose to keep their propaganda piece as is, shelve the Daily episode, and hope that everyone just moved on. Incredibly, the lead author of that piece, Jeffrey Gettleman, was at great pains to explain that as a journalist, he did not see his job as providing evidence for his reporting claims. Take a listen.
I don't want to even use the word evidence, because evidence is almost like a legal term that suggests you're trying to prove an allegation or prove a case in court. That's not my role.
No.
We all have our roles, and my role is to document, is to present information, is to give people a voice.
So if this investigation didn't include evidence, what the hell are we doing here? But as if all of that wasn't wild enough, we are now learning some absolutely shocking things about the background of the second reporter on that piece, the aforementioned Anat Schwartz. Shout out to Z Squirrel for doing this digging online. First of all, on October 7th, Anat liked to post calling for Gaza to be turned into a slaughterhouse. This post was so overtly genocidal in its rhetoric that it was actually cited in South Africa's filing at The Hague. The post read in part, one principle that needs to be abandoned today, proportionality. Need a disproportionate response. May Israel see what she is hiding in the basement. If all the captives are not returned immediately, turn the strip into a slaughterhouse. If a hair falls from their head, execute security prisoners, violate any norm on the way to victory. The post goes on to explain, quote, those in front of us are human animals. Anat also apparently liked a post about that 40 beheaded babies lie, and another one calling for an effective propaganda operation to equate Hamas with ISIS. Love for our journalists to be out here explicitly advocating for propaganda campaigns.
This is psychotic, obviously, goes without saying. Absolutely psychotic, genocidal language. It's just amazing that it only works that way on one side to be called out. Like, imagine they call just like pro-Palestinian protesters terrorists and Hamas sympathizers, or they'll just call them terrorists. But if you're on the pro-Israeli side, you can come out and straight up call for the slaughter of millions of humans and get away with it. Like, it's amazing. People will lose their jobs just for saying free Palestine. Continually see and consistently see the most genocidal, bloodthirsty lunatics, murderous shit, and nothing happens. No one even bats an eye. It really tells you everything you need to know about the media landscape in this country and everything you need to know about who is controlling the narrative, what we're not allowed to say and what we are allowed to say, and who is allowed to speak freely and who is not.
This is completely insane. If a journalist had liked similarly genocidal post calling for Israel to be turned into a slaughterhouse, it would be a national scandal. The entire New York Times leadership would be dragged in front of congressional hearings and summarily fired. In fact, the New York Times forced out a prominent staff writer who was not involved in Israel-Palestine coverage simply for signing a letter opposing Israel's genocide in Gaza. The International Court of Justice, of course, has now agreed that it is in fact plausible Israel is committing genocide. Now, after Anat's posts were exposed, she locked down her Twitter account, deleted most of her history before returning. But while she can delete her social media history, she can't really so easily delete her professional past, which, if anything, is actually even wilder. So apparently, prior to landing this plum gig at the New York Times, Anat Schwartz had never worked as a journalist, never published a single piece anywhere ever.
Amazing.
Before being scooped up by the Times in November, just after the October 7th attack. She had been working as a small-time filmmaker. Perhaps the Times was looking for someone with a flair for the cinematic. But really think about this. Actual journalists spend their entire careers dreaming of a New York Times byline. The Times, after all, is the holy grail of elite journalism. And this lady, with literally zero experience, somehow gets brought in on a highly sensitive investigation on one of the most fraught topics imaginable. How the hell did this happen? But Anat is not only a former filmmaker, she is also a former IDF soldier who served, I kid you not, in an Air Force intelligence unit. So the lady with the genocidal social media posts, with no prior journalism experience and a background in Israeli military intelligence, was contracted to report on a piece which perfectly served Israeli government propaganda efforts at the time. What is happening here? Ryan, of course, has been doing great reporting as usual. He has got it from several sources. The Times is parting ways with Anat. It's already been reported she is under investigation. But at this point, those actions seem like convenient scapegoating to cover up much graver questions. Who brought this lady in? How did they find her? Who greenlit this piece? Why have they not addressed the journalistic collapse of their supposedly blockbuster investigation? And what other Israeli propaganda and lies are they currently laundering? It's not only the New York Times, by the way. Wall Street Journal recently published a piece based on zero evidence that ran cover for Israeli claims about UNRWA, which helped justify the U.S. pulling aid at a time when Palestinians in Gaza are starving to death. That piece, too, was co-authored by a so-called journalist named Carrie Keller-Lynn with undeniable biases. She, too, served in the IDF and in an interview bragged about how her very close friend literally created social media for the IDF. Those are her words, not mine. Once these photos that you can see on your screen started circulating, Carrie Keller-Lynn also locked her accounts, scrubbed her history to prevent anyone from gathering further insights into her pro-Israel bias. Now, this incident casts in a whole new light. The studies would show systematic bias across major news outlets when it comes to coverage of Israelis and coverage of Palestinians. Israelis are slaughtered, Palestinians just mysteriously die. Great pains are often taken to make sure that Israel is never directly ascribed blame. And as the Palestinian death toll has climbed, the coverage of their deaths has actually plummeted. It is a testament to the outrageous nature of the suffering that, in spite of this onslaught of lies and propaganda, the American people still overwhelmingly support a ceasefire. Even Anat, with her skills as a filmmaker, with an Israeli intelligence background, can't craft propaganda strong enough to overcome the visceral horror of what has been done.
Points for doing this. I mean, it's so insane. Like, let it sink in for a second. It is the entire media crafting this propaganda. And then they go, oh, we'll investigate her. No. That is a cover your ass operation. Because as Krystal rightly pointed out, why was she brought in the first place? Who did bring her in? Who did allow her to be on that byline and greenlight that propaganda piece that had absolutely no evidence, any evidence, for the New York Times? The New York Times, which is supposed to be like the paper of record, they call it. Are starving to death daily. And there are thousands of aid trucks right at the Egyptian border that are being blocked by settlers, and they have no funding for UNRWA because we cut it along with other nations because of a story that was laundered by this exact type of propagandist to claim with no evidence that Hamas were working in UNRWA. This story is so insane. I truly hope that more people cover it, that more people talk about this, because if you look at this story and you start to see the lie built on the lie, built on the lie, built on the lie, and who is behind it, the entire thing falls apart. The entire thing falls apart. And this whole slaughter of the Palestinians right now is predicated on this propaganda, on these beheaded babies hoaxes, on the hoax that there were all these mass rapes. Okay, so The Intercept just wrote this piece, the story behind the New York Times October 7th expose. And you know what? Even at the time that I read it, I was like, where's the evidence? Like, it literally was just atrocity propaganda. It literally was just atrocity agitprop. Okay, so let's read this. Anat Schwartz had a problem. The Israeli filmmaker, I'm sorry, I'm just not going to get over that. This asshole wasn't even a fucking journalist. And former Air Force intelligence official had been assigned by the New York Times to work with her nephew. Okay, there's already a lot of problems with that. And veteran Times reporter Jeffrey Gettleman on an investigation into sexual violence by Hamas on October 7th that could reshape the way the world understood Israel's ongoing war in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip, on Gaza. By November, the global opposition was mounting against Israel's military campaign, which had already killed thousands of children, women, and the elderly. On her social media feed, which the Times has since said it is reviewing. Okay. Schwartz liked a tweet saying that Israel needed to turn the Gaza Strip into a slaughterhouse. Again, that would have gotten anybody else fired, like immediately. Violate any norm on the way to victory, read the Post. Those in front of us are human animals who do not hesitate to violate minimal rules. The New York Times, however, does have rules and norms. Schwartz had no prior reporting experience. Her reporting partner, Gettleman, explained the basics to her, Schwartz said in a podcast interview on January 3rd, produced by Israel's Channel 12 and conducted in Hebrew. Gettleman, she said, was concerned that they get at least 2 sources for every detail we put into the article. Cross-check information. Do we have forensic evidence? Do we have visual evidence? By the way, no and no. Apart from telling our reader this happened, what can we say? Can we tell what happened to whom? Schwartz said she was initially reluctant to take the assignment because she did not want to look at visual images of potential assaults and because she lacked the expertise to conduct such an investigation. Which, again, is just so insane. You're not a journalist, but you're going to be put on the paper of records, major investigation into something as serious as this? Like, be fucking for real. Victims of sexual assault are women who have experienced something, and then to come and sit in front of such a woman, who am I anyway? Yeah, you're right. Good question. Who are you? She said, I have no qualification. I like how she admits that she has no qualifications and yet was put on this story anyway. Like, this is fucking wild. Nonetheless, she began working with Gettleman on the story. She explained in the podcast interview, Gettleman, a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, Lamau, is an international correspondent, and when he is sent to the Bureau, he works with news assistants and freelancers on stories. In this case, several newsroom sources familiar with the process said Schwartz and Sella did the vast majority of the ground reporting while Gettleman focused on the framing and writing. The resulting report, published in late December, was headlined Screams Without Words, How Hamas Weaponized Sexual Violence on October 7th. It was the Israeli war effort at a time when even some Israeli allies were expressing concern over its large-scale killing of civilians in Gaza. And that is it. They saw that support was waning. They saw that there was mounting opposition to the siege and the genocide in Gaza. So they decided they were going to put out this propaganda in order to continue to justify their mass killing. Inside the newsroom, the article was met with praise from editorial leaders, but skepticism from other Times journalists. The paper's flagship podcast, The Daily, attempted to turn the article into an episode, but it didn't manage to get through a fact check, as The Intercept previously reported. Amazing. You couldn't even get through a fact check from your own paper's podcast. The fear among Times staffers who had been critical of the paper's Gaza coverage is that Schwartz will become a scapegoat for what is a much deeper failure. Exactly. She may harbor animosity toward Palestinians. Well, that's one way to put it. Lack the experience with investigative journalism and feel conflicting pressures between being a supporter of Israel's war effort and a Times reporter, but Schwartz did not commission herself and her nephew to report one of the most consequential stories of the war. Senior leadership at the Times did. Exactly. So this genocidal racist lunatic does deserve to be criticized, but we need to look deeper than her. Like, we need to look at the institutional failure. Who the fuck greenlit this? Who the fuck brought her in? Schwartz said as much in an interview with Israeli Army Radio on December 31st. The New York Times said, let's do an investigation into sexual violence. It was more of a case of them having to convince me, she said. Her host cut her off. It was a proposal of the New York Times, the entire thing. Unequivocally. Obviously, of course, she said. The paper stood behind us 200% and gave us the time, the investment, the resources to go in depth, the investigation as much as we needed. Okay, why did they go to you, though? Because you said you don't have any experience. You said you don't know what you're doing. So why was the New York Times coming to you with all their muscle, their weight, their money, and their investigative resources to you when you said that you are not qualified to be looking into this? Shortly after the war broke out, some editors and reporters complained that the Times standards barred them from referring to Hamas as terrorists. Well, let's just be real about this. They're only considered terrorists by the West. The UN does not recognize them as terrorists. Okay? Most countries don't recognize them as terrorists. They're the governing body of the Gaza Strip. So that's how this game is played. You just decide someone is a terrorist and then you can put a blockade on them. But Hamas were elected. They were elected and they're the governing body of Gaza. So that's who you fucking deal with. And the militant wing is their militant wing. They are militants. They are a resistance group. But you're mad because you want to use propaganda to call them terrorists? Because if we're gonna call Hamas terrorists, then we need to call the IOF terrorists. Like, you can't just play these games of the resistance is terrorists, but the IOF that are going in and posing in little girls' beds with Tweety animals and laughing about how they killed them, they're not terrorists. The people that are going into Palestinians' home and looting their shit and then posting their loot on social media. Okay. The rationale from the Standards Department, run for 14 years by Philip Corbett, had long been that Hamas was the de facto administrator of a specific territory rather than a stateless terror group. Exactly. But that is the fact. They're not a stateless terror group. They're the administrators of the Gaza Strip. Deliberately killing civilians, went the argument, was not enough to label a group of terrorists, as the label could apply quite broadly, including to Israel. Corbett, after October 7th, defended the policy in the face of pressure, newsroom sources said, but he lost. On October 19th, an email went out on behalf of executive editor Joe Kahn saying that Corbett had asked to step back from his position after 14 years as the embodiment of Times standards. Phil Corbett has told us that he'd like to take a step back. I just love the way they always put things in corporate language. Like, they're like, no, sir, we are going to call them a terrorist group, even though you've been the one who's been here for 14 years and had a really good record, and you're saying they're not. So you need to leave, and we're just going to call it you're taking a step back to spend more time with your family or some shit like that. And let someone else take the leading role in this crucial effort, Times leadership explained. Oh my gosh, total garbage. 3 newsroom sources said that this move was tied to a lot of pressure he was under to soften coverage in Israel's favor. This is supposed to be a newsroom. This is supposed to be a newsroom. And by the way, this is not unique to them. There are pieces about CNN getting orders from the top saying that they needed to change the way that they worded certain things. They needed to be more favorable toward Israel in their coverage. Okay? Like this at the Wall Street Journal. Like, it's everywhere, you guys. It is a blanket across the board. The fucking line has gone out. This is how we are going to approach this. Tied to the pressure he was under. So, okay. One of the social media posts that Schwartz liked, triggering the Times review, made the case that for Israeli propaganda purposes, Hamas should be likened at all times to the Islamic State. A Times spokesperson told The Intercept, "Your understanding about Phil Corbett is flatly untrue." Since the revelations regarding Schwartz's recent social media activity, her byline has not appeared in the paper, and she has not attended editorial meetings. The paper said, I mean, why should she? She doesn't work there and she's not a journalist. The paper said in a review into her social media, likes is ongoing. Those likes are unacceptable violations of our company policy, said the Times. So is it though? Is it? The bigger scandal may be the reporting itself, the process that allowed it into print, and the life-altering impact the reporting had for thousands of Palestinians whose deaths were justified by the alleged systemic sexual violence orchestrated by Hamas, the paper claimed to have exposed. Right, claimed to have exposed, again, without evidence, as a pretext and an excuse and justification for the continuing dehumanization of Palestinian civilians who are getting slaughtered daily. And they have been systemically trying to dehumanize them. How many times have we seen a fucking congressperson like that one clown walking through the hallway that said, kill them all? Or Brian Mass saying, there are no innocent Palestinian civilians. This is just more effort by our entire media, entire establishment media, the so-called paper of record, to dehumanize the Palestinian population, to okay their mass slaughter, okay? That's what that is. Another frustrated Times reporter who has already worked as an editor there said, a lot of focus will understandably rightfully be directed at Schwartz, but this most clearly is poor editorial decision-making that undermines all the other great work being tirelessly done across the paper, both related and completely unrelated to the war that manages to challenge our readers and meet our standards. Challenge our readers, lol. The Channel 12 podcast interview with Schwartz, which The Intercept translated from Hebrew, opens a window into the reporting process of the controversial story and suggests that the New York Times mission was to bolster a predetermined narrative. Exactly. It wasn't about getting so much of this, okay? And that applies to so many things. So much of this was not about getting to the truth and investigating what happened. It was about bolstering a predetermined narrative. That's what all of it is. That's what all the reporting on Gaza is. That's what all the propaganda from the IOF is. It's what all their social media is. It's fucking all of it. In a response to The Intercept's questions about Schwartz's podcast interview, a spokesperson for the New York Times walked back the blockbuster article's framing that evidence showed Hamas had weaponized sexual violence to a softer claim that there may have been systemic use of sexual violence. Where? Sexual assault, sorry. Where? Times International editor Phil Pan said in a statement that he stands by the work. Embarrassing. What work? Miss Schwartz was a part of a rigorous reporting. Wow. Rigorous reporting and editing process, he said. She made valuable contributions and we saw no evidence of bias in her work. Okay, you should be fired too then. If you're so fucking incompetent that you can't see the bias in her work, the fact that she had no experience, the fact that she said she had no experience, her social media posts, and the fact that she used to work for the IOF, maybe you ought to be fucking fired too because you're a fucking moron. How about that? Okay, we remain confident in the accuracy of our reporting and stand by the team's investigation. These people are so embarrassing. But as we have said, her likes are offensive and opinionated social media posts predating her work with us are unacceptable. Why didn't you check? I thought it was rigorous. Why didn't you check, Playboy? I thought you guys did rigorous reporting. After this story was published, Schwartz, who did not respond for requests for comment, tweeted to thank the Times for standing behind the important stories we have published. She added, the recent attacks against me will not deter me from continuing my work. Addressing her social media activity, Schwartz said, I understand why people who do not know me were offended by the inadvertent like. Oh, right, because as Squirrel said, it was an accident. I pressed on October 7th, and I apologize for that. At least 3 of her likes have been the subject of public scrutiny. Wow. So something is wrong with her thumb. Every time she sees a genocidal post, it like inadvertently just hits it. It's like liar, liar when he can't control the pen. In the podcast interview, Schwartz details her extensive efforts to get confirmation from Israeli hospitals, rape crisis centers, trauma recovery facilities, and sex assault hotlines in Israel, as well as her inability to get a single confirmation from any of them. All of those places that would have been sources to confirm if there actually was rape and widespread sexual assault on October 7th, not a single one. Not a single one confirmed to her that that happened. And yet they ran the story anyway. Not a single one confirm that that happened, and yet they fucking ran the story anyway. Guys, it's so fucking unbelievable. Like, this is, honestly, this is probably the biggest fucking scandal of the New York Times and the biggest hoax ran on the international and American community since WMDs. Like not even fucking kidding. This is probably the biggest fucking propaganda lie propagated on the American people and the world since WMDs. She was told that there had been no complaints made of sexual assault. Jeez. The Times spokesperson acknowledged. You know what I love? The guy previously is like, we stand by our work and our rigorous reporting. Okay. But she just said none of them confirmed it. No one got back to her. There were no complaints of sexual assaults. That's what she said. No one told her that. No one confirmed that to her. And yet they ran the piece anyway. And he says that they stand by it. Stand by which part? What part? The part that didn't make it in there? Because you'll note that she said herself that there was no confirmation of any of these so-called mass rapes, but that didn't make it in the piece. There was no part in the piece that said, hey, by the way, no one came forward to say this. Hey, by the way, there is no confirmation that any of this happened. Hey, by the way, no one even made claims of sexual assault. None of that's in the fucking piece, but you stand by it. The Times spokesperson acknowledged after The Intercept brought the Channel 12 podcast episode to the paper's attention. This, however, was just the very first step of her research. She then describes the unfolding of evidence, testimonies, and eventual evidence that there may have been systemic use of sexual assault. The spokesperson asserted. She details her research in steps and emphasizes the Times' strict standard to corroborate evidence and meeting with reporters and editors to discuss probing questions and think critically about the story. All of that was just fluff. Like, none of that meant, like, literally, that doesn't mean anything. The question has never been whether individual acts of sexual assault may have occurred on October 7th. Rape is not uncommon in war, and there were also several hundred civilians who poured into Israel from Gaza that day in the second wave, contributing to and participating in the mayhem and the violence. The central issue is whether the New York Times presented solid evidence to support its claim that there were newly reported details establishing that the attacks against women were not isolated events, but part of a broader pattern of gender-based violence on October 7th. A claim stated in the headline that Hamas deliberately deployed sexual violence as a weapon of war, which again, there was fucking no evidence for. Zero, zilch, none, nada. Bupkis. Schwartz began her work on the violence of October 7th, where one would expect by calling around to the designated Room 4 facilities at 11 Israeli hospitals that examine and treat potential victims of sexual violence, including rape. First thing I called them all, they all told me no complaint of sexual assault was received. She recalled in the podcast interview. I had a lot of interviews which didn't lead anywhere. Like, I would go to all kinds of psychiatric hospitals, sit in front of the staff. All of them were fully committed to the mission, and no one had met a victim of sexual assault. The next step was to call the manager of the sexual assault hotline in Israel South, which proved equally fruitless. The manager told her that they had no reports of sexual violence. She described the call as crazy, in-depth conversation where she pressed for specific cases. Did anyone call you? Did you hear anything? She recalled asking. How could it be that you didn't? Because it didn't happen? Okay. As Schwartz began her own efforts to find evidence of sexual assault, the first specific allegation of rape began to emerge. A person identified in anonymous media interviews as a paramedic from the Israeli Air Force Medical Unit 669 claimed that he saw evidence that two teenage girls on a kibbutz Nahal Oz had been raped and murdered in their bedroom. The man made other outrageous claims. However, that called his report into question. He claimed another rescuer pulled out of the garbage a baby who had been stabbed multiple times. He also said that he had seen Arabic sentences that were written on entrances to houses with the blood of the people that were living in the houses. No such messages exist, and the story of the baby in the trash can has been debunked. The bigger problem was that no two girls at the kibbutz fit the source's description. In future interviews, he changed the location to Kibbutz Be'eri, but no victims killed there matched the description either, as Mandowis Weiss reported. Wow, this is all very convenient. After seeing these interviews, Schwartz started calling people at Kibbutz Be'eri and other kibbutzim that were targeted on October 7th in efforts to track down the story. Nothing there was nothing, she said. No one had seen or heard anything. She then reached out to the Unit 669 paramedic who relayed to Schwartz the same story that he had told other media outlets, which she says convinced her that there was systemic nature to the sexual violence. How stupid are you? Like, I know that you're not, it's just bad faith and you're a propagandist. But how stupid would you have been to just believe this guy's claim when you already knew that there was no evidence, that he had already lied and his claims had been debunked, that there was no description matching these girls that this had supposedly happened to, and you had already got done calling around to all these different outlets, all these different places, all these different hospitals, and had found nothing. But then you were just going to take this guy's word for it. I say, okay, so it happened. Like, that's your fact check? After all that investigation we just went through where you found nothing, some random guy who had already been debunked in other lies tells you a story and you go, okay, so I guess it happened. You have a story you can't prove and there's no evidence for and no victims of. But you're telling me, so I guess that's the evidence. Like, one person saw it happen in Be'eri, so it can't just be one person because it's two girls, it's sisters in the room. Something about it is systemic. Something about it feels to me that it's not random. You got that? So these are our professional so-called journalists and investigative reporters really on top of everything. One random liar tells a story that has no evidence to back it up, no details, no people attached to it, and after you had already found that no other people had reported sexual violence, but you feel that there's nothing random about it. So, it must be true. Let's just keep running with it. I mean, it's just fucking amazing. It's amazing how this went out. Schwartz said that she then began, and by the way, after this propaganda story ran out, it was everywhere. They used this as a source all over the fucking media. Officials were using it. Schwartz said she then began a series of extensive conversations with Israeli officials from Zaka, okay, so then we get back to Zaka, which we talked about earlier, a private ultra-Orthodox rescue organization that has been documented to have mishandled evidence and spread multiple false stories about October 7th, okay? Zaka is a propaganda group that defends pedophiles. They're a propaganda group. They are liars. They are the ones that propagated the babies in ovens hoax, okay? So the private ultra-Orthodox rescue organization that has been documented to have mishandled evidence and spread multiple false stories about the events on October 7th, including debunked allegations of Hamas operatives beheading babies and cutting the fetus out from a pregnant woman's body. Its workers are not trained forensic scientists or crime scene experts. When we go into a house, we use our imagination. How is that real? Like, how is that real? Guys, imagine for a second, like imagine like you're watching Dateline or something. Like I know, I watch Dateline. Embarrassing, I know, but I do. But imagine you're watching Dateline or Forensic Files or any of those shows. And they go, we're not any crime experts. We are not bringing any crime experts in here. We're not bringing any forensic pathologists in here. We're not bringing any, anything, any professionals. Okay. No, like nothing. We're just going to bring in people. How did they put it? Forensic scientists and experts. We go and use our imagination. Like, just imagine that for a second. Like, not even a corner. Okay. They're like, no, we're just going to bring people in and they're going to use their imagination. Imagine that being presented as evidence in a case here. Would anyone accept that? I don't fucking think so. Okay. Oh my gosh. A senior Zaka official. Also, why would you admit that? That's super embarrassing. Like, you're admitting you're just making shit up. We're using our imagination. Landau was featured in the Times report, though no mention is made of his well-documented track record of disseminating sensational stories of atrocities that were later proven false. Schwartz said that in her initial interviews, Zaka members did not make any specific allegations of rape, but described a general condition of bodies that they said they saw. They told me, yeah, we saw naked women, or we saw a woman without underwear, both naked, without underwear, and tied with zip ties, and sometimes not zip ties. Sometimes rope a string of a hoodie. Schwartz continued to look for forensic evidence at various sites of attack and found no witnesses to corroborate stories of rape. And so I searched a lot into the kibbutzim, and apart from this testimony of the Israeli military paramedic, and additionally, here and there, Zaka people, the stories, didn't emerge from there, she said. So they had nothing. They had Zaka liars and propagandists from this propaganda organization, and then one IDF soldier who had already been proved to lie. Both of their sources, okay, both of her sources had already been proven liars. Both had already been proven to be propagating hoaxes. As she continued to work the phones with rescue officials, Schwartz then saw interviews that international news channels began airing with Sherry Mendez, an American architect who served in a rabbinical unit of the Israeli Defense Forces. Mendez, who was deployed to the morgue to prepare bodies for burial after October 7th attacks, claimed to have seen voluminous evidence of sexual assault. Where? We saw evidence of rape, Mendez stated in the interview. Pelvis is broken. It was probably takes a lot to break a pelvis. And this was among the grandmothers down to small children. This is not just something we saw on the internet. We saw these bodies with our own eyes. Mendez has been ubiquitous figure in the Israeli government and major media narratives on sexual violence on October 7th, despite the fact that she has no medical or forensic credentials to legally determine rape. She had also spoken about other violence on October 7th, telling the Daily Mail in October a baby was cut out of a pregnant woman and beheaded, and then the mother was beheaded. No pregnant woman died that day, according to the official Israeli list of those killed in the attacks. And the independent research collective October 7th fact check said that Mendez' story was false. So just more lies. And what's amazing to me is that no matter how much this shit was propagated in the media all over the world, in American media, in fucking UK media, no one bothered to look into these people's credentials. No one bothered to look into this woman and see that she had no credentials to be determining whether or not somebody was raped. It's truly amazing. I have never seen, or at least not seen in a really long, no, I don't think I've ever seen this massive failure of quote unquote investigative reporting. Never. After Schwartz saw an interview with Mendez, she was further convinced. See how this propaganda just feeds itself? It's like a lie that keeps feeding itself. So she has no evidence for herself, but it's like telephone, you know? She heard this Israeli paramedic say this, which she had already been caught lying and he had no evidence. She heard this Mendez woman say this, of which she had no corroborating evidence, of which she had no forensic evidence, and of which the woman that she was listening to had no credentials to be making the statements she was making. This is literally reporting by I heard a friend of a friend of a friend. How the hell do you guys make fun of social media and TikTok and Twitter? Oh, you just get your information off of TikTok and Twitter and social media. Bro, that's literally what this is. This so-called journalist and this so-called journalistic gold standard paper of record, all of their reporting was, I heard someone say. That's it. Literally all the reporting is, I heard someone say. And even when they looked into the reporting to see if there was forensic or corroborating evidence, the answer was no. But they ran with it anyway. Further convinced. of the systemic rape narrative was true. I'm like, wow, what is this? She recalled. And it feels to me, glad that we're making serious reporting decisions about life and death issues for an entire population of people in the paper of record. I'm glad we're doing that based off of our feelings. That's nice. That's nice. Fuck reporting. We're doing things based off of our feels now. Feels like it's starting to approach a plurality, even if you don't know which numbers to put on it yet. Or people, since there was no actual people that you can bring forward to say this happened to. At the same time, Schwartz said that she felt conflicted at times, wondering if she was becoming convinced of the truth of an overreaching story precisely because she was looking for evidence to support the claim. You should have looked further into that, that feeling. Because since you like to go off your feelings, that feeling that you had that maybe you were overreaching, you probably should have looked into that more. You probably should have explored that more. I kept wondering all the time whether if I was just hear about rape and see rape and think about it, whether that's just because I'm leaning toward that, she said. She pushed those doubts aside. LOL. Of course you did. She pushed that. Of course you did. By the time Schwartz By the time Schwartz interviewed Mendez, the idea for Zerva's story had ricocheted around the world and been conclusively debunked. No baby was cut from a mother and beheaded, yet Schwartz and the New York Times would go on to rely on Mendez's testimony, as well as those other witnesses with track records of making unreliable claims and lacking forensic credentials. No mention was made of questions about Mendez's credibility, which tells you again right there that this was purposeful lying. This was not a mistake. By the time she'd interviewed Mendez, it had already been debunked, but she did it anyway. And none of them mentioned in the story, in the hoax story, the questions about their credibility. Not once. How Schwartz landed in such an extraordinary position at a crucial moment in the war is not entirely clear. Prior to joining the Times, as a stringer last fall, her nephew, Sela, was a freelance journalist covering stories on issues ranging from food, photography, and culture to peace efforts, economics, and the occupation. According to his LinkedIn profile, Sela's first collaboration with Gettleman, published on October 14th, was a look at the trauma experienced by students of the university in southern Israel. For Schwartz, her first byline landed on November 14th. Israel police officials shared more evidence on Tuesday of atrocities committed during October 7th Hamas-led attacks, saying they had collected testimonies from more than 1,000 witnesses and the survivors about sexual violence and other abuses, Schwartz reported. The story went on to quote Israel's police chief, Kobi Shabtai, explaining a litany of evidence of gruesome killings and sexual assaults on October 7th. This is the most extensive investigation the state of Israel has ever known. Why? Why would you say that? That's just so embarrassing. Said in the Schwartz article, promising ample evidence would be provided soon. Okay? This is literally investigation by Trust Me, Bro. This is the most extensive investigation the state of Israel has ever known. But we'll be next time. We'll be proving it next time. When the Times later produced its definitive Screams Without Words investigation, however, Schwartz and her partners reported that contrary to Shabtai's claim, forensic evidence of the sexual violence was non-existent. Got that? So this was the most extensive. It was the most extensive interview in the history of Israel. And yet, forensic evidence of mass rape was non-existent. Without acknowledging the past statements by Shabtai in the Times, the paper reported that quick funerals in accordance with Jewish tradition meant evidence was not preserved. Unnamed experts told the Times that sexual violence in wars often leaves limited forensic evidence. Yeah, that's really convenient. You know what that reminds me of, not to bring it back to Dateline? It reminds me of when in these Dateline stories you see when a spouse will like kill their wife or something, and then they immediately want them cremated because they don't want evidence of the crime. So they are like, no, we got to cremate him. We got to cremate him now, bury him now, because they don't want there to be like a real investigation. You're telling me that one of the biggest attacks in Israel's history, okay, in their history, that you didn't bother to collect rape kits or forensic evidence on these so-called rape victims? On the podcast, Schwartz said that her next step was to go to a new holistic therapy facility established to address the trauma of October 7th victims, particularly those who endured the carnage at the Nova Music Festival. Opened a week after the attack, the facility began welcoming hundreds of survivors where they could seek counseling, do yoga, and receive alternative medicine, as well as acupuncture, sound healing, and reflexology treatments. They called it Merhav Marp, or healing space. Be amazing to have some. In multiple visits to Merhav Marp or Marpe, I don't know, Schwartz again said in the podcast interview that she found no direct evidence of rape or sexual violence. She expressed frustration with the therapists and counselors at the facilities, saying that they engaged in a conspiracy of silence. Everyone, even those who heard these kinds of things from people, felt very committed to their patients, or even just the people who had assisted their patients, to not reveal things, she said. Oh, okay, so she's claiming that, the only reason why, like, no one actually came forward and said anything was because for some reason, the other Israeli doctors were trying to cover it up. Like, this is so ridiculous. In the end, Schwartz came away with only innuendo and general statements from therapists about how people process trauma, ashamed to speak out, experiencing survivor's guilt, or were still in shock. Perhaps also because Israeli society is conservative, there was some inclination to keep silent about this issue of sexual abuse. I love that. If you can't find evidence, just project it. Just project it. Oh, it's probably because you want to keep silent. It's probably because of that. It's a cultural thing. Schwartz speculated, of course. It's all speculation. Literally. It's all speculation and your depraved imaginations. It's all speculation and your deranged, depraved imaginations. Okay? Schwartz speculated. On top of this, there's probably an added dimension of the religious national aspect, that this was done by a terrorist, by someone from Hamas, she added. There were lots and lots of layers that made it so that they didn't speak. I like how she's just making shit up. Like, so she went to this center, and because she didn't find what she wanted to find, which was the mass rape hoaxes, she just decided that she was going to create out of whole cloth the reason why these supposed victims weren't coming forward. Like, amazing. According to the published Times article, 2 therapists said that they were working with a woman who was gang raped at the rave, and it was in no condition to talk to investigators or reporters. Schwartz said she had focused on kibbutzim because she had initially determined it was unlikely sexual assaults had occurred at the Nova Music Festival. I was very skeptical that it had happened at the area of the party because everyone I spoke to among the survivors told me about a chase, a race, like about moving from place to place, she recalled. How would they have had the time to mess with a woman like, it is impossible. Either you hide or you die. Also, it's public, the Nova, such an open space. Schwartz watched interviews given to international media outlets by Raz Cohen, who attended the Nova Music Festival. A veteran of Israel's Special Forces, Cohen did multiple interviews about a rape that he claimed to have witnessed. A few days after the attacks, he told PBS NewsHour that he had witnessed multiple rapes. The terrorists, people from Gaza, raped girls, and after they raped them, they killed them, murdered them with knives, the opposite, killed, and after they raped them, they did that, he said. At an appearance on CNN on January 4th, he described seeing one rape and said that the assailants were 5 guys, 5 civilians from Gaza, normal guys, not soldiers, not Nakaba. I'm going to have to look up what that means. I don't know what that means. He says, referring to Hamas's elite commando force. It was regular people from Gaza with normal clothes. In Cohen's interview with Schwartz for the Times, he said he saw 5 men wearing civilian clothes, all carrying knives and one carrying a hammer, dragging a woman across the ground. She was young, naked, and screaming. They all gathered around her. Mr. Cohen says she's standing up. They start raping her. I saw the men standing in a half circle around her. One penetrates her. She screams. I still remember her voice, screams without words. Then one of them raises a knife, he said, and they just slaughtered her. Like, these people are sick. Like, the way that they go into, like, graphic detail about, like, this atrocity happening to this woman that they have zero evidence for. Like, this shit is in your imagination, and you're so detailed and so graphic about it, it's fucking sick. And the reason why it's so sick is because, as I always say, every accusation is a confession. You're saying that about them because that's the kind of fantasy shit that you have that you want to do to the Palestinians. And how many times has this probably happened to a Palestinian girl? How many times does that probably happen at the hands of the IOF to a Palestinian little girl or a Palestinian woman? And it's also a way to try to dehumanize Palestinian men. They're all barbarians, not just Hamas. It's the civilians, you see. The civilian men are barbarians. It was in this interview that gave the Times the title Screams Without Words, How Hamas Weaponized Sexual Violence on October 7th, that Cohen had described alleged assailants as not being members of Hamas, undermines the headline, but it remains unchanged. The Times did not address Cohen's earlier claims that he had witnessed multiple rapes. Schwartz said in the podcast interview that since the Times insisted on at least 2 sources, that she asked Cohen to give her contact information of the other people he was hiding with in the bush so she could corroborate his story of the rape, she recalled. Ross hides in the bush next to him, lies his friend Shom. They get to the bush. There are 2 other people on the other side looking to the other direction, and among them a 5th person, 5 people in the same bush. Only Ross sees all the things he sees. Everyone else is looking a different direction. Come on. So you're claiming you saw all kind of rapes, okay? You saw all these rapes, a woman screaming, getting knifed up by all these Palestinians, and you're with 4 other people, but all of them were just chilling this way. They didn't see anything. They didn't say, they're all chilling this way. You're the only one. And you didn't like point to them. Like, I just think that's weird too. You're watching this gang rape of this woman and you don't bother to say any to your friends, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this is happening. You just kept it to yourself. Like, come on. This is so ridiculous. Despite saying on the podcast that only Cohen witnessed the event and others were looking in different directions, in the Times story, Shom Gera is presented as a corroborating witness to the rape. He said he saw at least 4 men step out of a van and attack the woman who ended up between their legs. He said that they were talking, giggling, and shouting, and that one of them stabbed her with a knife repeatedly, literally butchering her. Okay, but I thought you guys just said that he was looking the other way. Guada did not mention witnessing a rape in the interview. He did with NBC News on October 8th, a day after the attack, but he did describe seeing a woman murdered with a knife. We saw terrorists killing people, burning cars, shouting everywhere. Guada told NBC, if you just say something, if you make any noise, you'll be murdered. Guada subsequently deployed to Gaza with the IDF and has posted many videos on TikTok of himself rummaging through Palestinian homes. Cohen and Guada did not respond to requests for comment. Okay, so he was interviewed right after and didn't say anything about witnessing a rape. Then all of a sudden saw all these mass rapes. And apparently he is one of the pieces of garbage, he's a terrorist, okay? This piece of garbage going in and rummaging through Palestinian stuff and stealing and looting from their homes and then bragging about it on TikTok. That's one of the things that amazes me so much about the IOF is that I don't know what the fuck they're thinking. Their social media makes them look like monsters because they are monsters, but they don't even pretend. They don't even do like how America's military will do propaganda of them just looking very like serious and good guy. The IOF literally post deranged shit of themselves being pieces of human debris on social media and then post it and then are like, yeah. Like, it's amazing. It really is. The Independent's site October 7th fact check, Mondoweiss and journalist Ali Abunimah of Electric Antifada and Max Blumenthal of The Gray Zone have flagged numerous inconsistencies and contradictions in the stories told in the Times report, including the account of Cohen, who had initially said that he chose not to look, but could hear them laughing constantly. All right, didn't look, then you looked, whatever. Under pressure internally to defend the veracity of the story, the Times reassigned Gettleman, Schwartz, and Sella to effectively re-report the story, resulting in an article published on January 29th. Cohen declined to speak to them, they reported. Oh, that's convenient. Why? You saw these rapes. I mean, first you didn't, then you did, but now you don't want to talk to them again. That's weird. That's weird. They reported, asked this month why he had not mentioned the rape at first, Mr. Cohen cited the stress of his experience and sent a text message that he had not realized then that he was one of the few surviving witnesses. He declined to be interviewed again, saying that he was working to recover from the trauma that he suffered. You know what's weird is that you didn't mention the rape at first because you were so traumatized, but you didn't have any problem mentioning any of the other deaths? Like, okay, that's odd. In addition to Cohen's testimony, Schwartz said on the Channel 12 podcast that she also watched a video of an interrogation of a Palestinian prisoner taken in by the IDF, who she said described girls being dragged by Palestinian attackers into the woods near the Nova Festival. She also, what woods? What? The Nova Festival was like a huge open field. Okay. She was also moved, she said, by a clip of an interview she watched in November at a press conference hosted by Israeli officials, the one that became the focus of her first Times article. An accountant named Sapir described the lurid scene of rape and mutilation, and Schwartz said that she became fully convinced there was systemic program of sexual violence by Hamas. Her testimony is crazy and hair-raising and huge and barbaric, Schwartz said. And it's not just rape, it's rape and amputation. And I realize it's a bigger story than I imagined, with many locations, and then pictures starts to emerge. What's going on here? Yeah, that's interesting. That's very, again, convenient that this picture started to emerge here of just nothing that you could confirm, just the occasional story by people who are connected to the IDF. It's just weird, They just all happen to be connected to the IOF. Just, nothing to see here. The Times report states that they interviewed Sapir for 2 hours at a cafe in southern Israel, and she described witnessing multiple rapes, including an incident where one attacker rapes a woman and another cuts off her breast with a box cutter. Oh yeah, I forgot about that hoax that they still are perpetrating, claiming that Hamas were raping people, cutting off their boobs, and then playing with them, playing hacky sack with them. These people are sick. Like I said, they're fucking depraved. That they make up such disgusting, in-depth, atrocity propaganda and then spread it. Again, there is no evidence of any of this, and yet they're spreading it anyway. The box cutter hoax, the boob hoax. I think it was Rabbi Shmuley that went on Piers Morgan and without any pushback continued to talk about the quote unquote cutting off of the breast hoax. At the press conference in November, Israeli authorities said that they were collecting and examining forensic materials that would confirm Sapir's specifically detailed accounts. Police say that they are still gathering evidence, DNA, etc., from rape victims in addition to eyewitnesses to build the strongest case possible. Where is that? Where's that at, bro? Where's that forensic and detailed DNA evidence? Such a scene would produce significant amount of physical evidence, yet Israeli officials have to date been unable to prove it. Exactly. Because again, if you actually had evidence of mass rape and breasts being cut off systemically, you would have evidence of that. And to date, they have produced approximately none. Okay. I have circumstantial evidence, but in the end, it's my duty to find supporting evidence for her story and to discover victims' identities. Yeah, again, weird how they don't have any victims coming forward. They don't have any victims coming forward to corroborate any of this, any of it. I'm talking about for the people that are still alive, that they're claiming that all of these things also happened to. Said Superintendent Adi Edri, the Israeli official leading the investigation into sexual violence on October 7th, a week after the Times report went online. At this stage, I have no specific bodies. That's really weird that you're reporting and claiming that there was widespread systemic sexual violence, but at this stage, you're the investigator, okay? You're the IOF investigator. But at this stage, you have no specific bodies, no evidence, no specific bodies. Guys, this didn't happen in the 80s where, like, there wasn't forensic DNA. This happened in 2024. We have so much advanced technology now. Israel has really advanced technology, has a very advanced military capability. Phones everywhere. But you don't have any bodies? Any forensic evidence? But the Times ran that story anyway. In the Channel 12 podcast, Schwartz is asked if firsthand testimonies of women who survived the rape on October 7th exist. I can't really speak about this, but the vast majority of women who have been sexually assaulted on October 7th were shot immediately after, and that's where the big numbers are. She replied, "The vast majority are corpses. Some women managed to escape and survive," she added. "I do know that there is a very significant element of disassociation when it comes to sexual assault. So a lot of times they don't remember. They don't remember everything. They remember fragments of the event, and they can always describe how they ended up on the road and how they were rescued." Okay. While it can't always describe how they were ended up on the road or how they were rescued. Okay, that's very convenient. That's very convenient. That all of the women that you're claiming were victims of this mass sexual violence were either conveniently killed, and yet you don't have their bodies. Because remember, the woman above said that they didn't have any bodies at this stage. You can check a corpse whether or not there is evidence of sexual violence. You can check for that. They don't have any bodies, though, at this point. And then she's trying to literally tell people who maybe have been traumatized by the event, well, you might be a victim of sexual violence, you just don't remember it. Well, that's convenient. In early December, and by the way, there are instances where somebody might be sexually assaulted and raped and not remember parts of it or block it out. That's true. That can happen. I just think that it's very convenient that no one does. That's your reasoning for having no evidence. In early December, Israeli officials launched an intensive public campaign accusing the international community and specifically feminist leaders of standing silent in the face of widespread systemic sexual violence of Hamas October 7th attacks. The PR effort was rolled out at the United Nations on December 4th with an event hosted by the Israeli ambassador and the former Meta executive Sheryl Sandberg. The feminist organizations targeted by the pro-Israeli figures were caught flat-footed as charges of sexual violence had not yet been circulated widely. Amazing. Amazing. That there's no evidence of this, but they rolled out a whole ass fucking propaganda campaign at the United Nations with no, it's just so amazing. Sandberg was also quoted attacking women's rights organizations in a December 4th New York Times article headline, "What We Know About Sexual Violence on October 7th Attacks in Israel," and whose publication, see, it's just all PR. So Sandberg, who is a hack over at Meta, is so Sandberg, who is one of like, I forget her exact title. I know I just read it a second ago, but she works for Meta. So she's launching this PR campaign about so-called sexual violence on the day of October 7th, and then calls out feminist leaders around the world for not saying anything about it as they produce no evidence. Oh my gosh. And whose publication coincided with the launch of the PR campaign. Oh, that's convenient. At the UN, the article also reported by Gettleman. Oh, that's also Schwartz and Sella relied on claims made by Israeli officials and acknowledged the Times had not yet been able to corroborate the allegations. A revealing correlation was subsequently appended to the story. An earlier version of this article misstated the kind of evidence Israel police had gathered investigating accusations of sexual violence committed on October 7th in the attack by Hamas against Israel. The police are relying mainly on witness testimony, not on autopsies or forensic evidence. When was the last time that a major decision was made in a forensic story, a story that involved rape or murder, that only relied on the testimony of people working for their government? No evidence, no forensic evidence, no evidence of rape, no rape kits, and yet we're going to rely on the word of IDF soldiers, of the government of Israel. That's who we're relying on for evidence. Israel promised it had extraordinary amounts of eyewitness testimony. Investigators have gathered tens of thousands of testimonies of sexual violence committed by Hamas on October 7th. Where it be, bro? We're now in March, okay? We're now in March. Where is it? According to the Israeli police, including the site of a music festival that was attacked, Schwartz Gettleman still reported on December 4th, those testimonies never materialized and still haven't. Yeah, there's tens of thousands of testimonies that they said were forthcoming on December 4th. It is now March. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu hammered on the theme in a December 5th speech in Tel Aviv. I say to the women's rights organizations, to the human rights organizations, you've heard the rape of Israeli women, horrible atrocities, sexual mutilation. Where the hell are you? The same day, President Joe Biden gave a speech in which he said the world can't just look away to what's going on. It's on all of us, the government, international organizations, civil society, individual citizens, to forcefully condemn the sexual violence of Hamas terrorists without equivocation, without exception. Okay. I just love that. So there's no evidence. There has been no evidence. But Netanyahu comes out and yells at all the international organizations and women's organizations, and Biden does the same. But literally, none of that is said about the mass slaughter of the Palestinian people and the claims that have been debunked about UNRWA and taking away their funding. Hey, motherfucker, why don't you not look away? How about that? How about you not look away at all the children dying in Gaza? All the women being murdered in Gaza, the food being withheld from Gaza. How about that? How about look at that without exception? The 2-month-long time investigation was still being edited and revised, Schwartz said in the podcast, when she started to feel concerned about the timing. So I said, we're missing momentum because maybe the UN isn't addressing sexual assault because no media outlet will come out with a declaration about what happened there. Yeah, you're right, guys. Maybe people aren't talking about it as much because we haven't produced any evidence. You know, there hasn't been any agitprop. There hasn't been enough propaganda. So maybe that's why they're not talking about it. We really got to get out in front of it. You know what I'm saying? If the Times story doesn't publish soon, she said, it may no longer be interesting. Schwartz said the delay was explained to her internally as, we don't want to make people sad before Christmas. Are you a news organization? Or are you like a motivational outlet to uplift people and make them feel good things? That makes no sense. Also, I like how she basically admits that they need to put out their propaganda in order to be able to justify decisions by the UN or women's groups or anybody else. Like, we need to come out and make a declaration. You'll notice she doesn't say anything about evidence. She doesn't say anything about facts. She says, we need the New York Times with our propaganda piece to come out and make a declaration. She also said that Israeli police sources were pressuring her to move quickly to publish. She said they asked her, what does the New York Times not believe? There were sexual assaults here. Schwartz felt like she was in the middle. That's also super sus. Why were Israeli police pressuring the New York Times to release an article that they should have been investigating and had no evidence for? Why were the Israeli authorities pressuring for a piece to be published with no evidence? I'm also in this place. I'm also an Israeli, but I also work for the New York Times, she said. So all the time I'm like in this place between a hammer and an anvil. Bro, you didn't even work for the Times until 5 minutes ago. You weren't even a journalist until 5 minutes ago. Screams on December 28th, Screams Without Words open with the story of Gal Abbush, described by the Times as the woman in the black dress. A video of her charred body appeared to show her bottomless. Israeli police officials said that they believe that Miss Abdush was raped, the Times reported. The article labeled Abdush a symbol of the horrors visited upon Israeli women and girls during the October 7th attacks. The Times report mentioned WhatsApp messages from Abdush and her husband to their family, but doesn't mention that some family members believe that the crucial message make the Israeli officials' claim implausible. As Mondois later reported, the family Abdush texted the family at 6:51 a.m. saying that they were in trouble at the border. At 7, her husband messaged to say that she had been killed. Her family said the charring came from a grenade. It doesn't make any sense, said Abdush's sister, that in a short time span they raped her, slaughtered her, and burned her. Speaking about the rape allegation, her brother-in-law said the media invented it. Okay, that is her own family saying it. That is her own family debunking the claim and being like, bitch, you just invented this. And she was the main person that they used for that fucking agitprop. Another relative suggested the family was pressured under false pretenses to speak with the reporters. Abdush's sister wrote on Instagram that the Times reporter mentioned that they want to write a report in memory of Gal, and that's it. If we knew that the title would be about rape and butchery, we never would have accepted it. In a follow-up story, the Times sought to discredit her initial comment, quoting Abdush's sister as saying, had been confused about what happened and was trying to protect my sister. So, guys, this is so insane. So they lie about what the family said. They take a story and report on it when the family didn't even say that, and then the family debunks it. Then when the sister calls them out and debunks what they said further, they turn around and discredit the sister and say she was confused. Now, I literally have never seen anything like this. This is seriously like the most fucking deranged propaganda ever to come out of a fucking international, like, paper of record mainstream media outlet. Like, it's insane. The woman who filmed Abdush on October 7th told the Israeli news site Ynet that Schwartz and Sella had pressured her into giving the paper the access to her photos and videos for the purpose of serving Israeli propaganda. They called me again and again and explained how important it is to Israeli Hasbara, she recalled, using the term for the public diplomacy, which in practice refers to Israeli propaganda efforts directed at international audiences. Guys, another, like, I'm having a hard time trying to like put into words like how insane this is. Like every line after the other is fucking insane. So the woman that took that video is legit being told, you need to give us this video. It is really important that you give us this video because we need it for Israeli propaganda to affect international audiences. What? Oh my gosh. At every turn, when the New York Times reporters ran into obstacles confirming tips, they turned to anonymous Israeli officials or witnesses who had already been interviewed repeatedly in the press. Months off their assignments, the reporters found themselves exactly where they had begun, relying overwhelmingly on the words of Israeli officials, soldiers, and the Zaka workers of the aforementioned propaganda pedophile group to substantiate their claim that more than 30 bodies of women and girls were discovered with signs of sexual abuse. On Channel 12 podcast, Schwartz said the last remaining piece she needed for the story was the solid number of the Israeli authorities about any possible survivors of sexual violence. We have 4 and we can stand behind that number, she said. She was told by the Ministry of Welfare and Social Affairs. No details were provided. The Times story ultimately reported there were at least 3 women and 1 man who were sexually assaulted and survived. When the story finally was okay, so they ran down all these sources, and when they couldn't find any evidence, they just returned back to the IDF and fucking Zaka. When the story was finally published on December 28th, Schwartz described the flood of emotions and reactions online in Israel. First of all, in the paper, we gave it a very, very prominent place, which is apropos of all my fears. There is no greater show of confidence than being put on the front page, she said. In Israel, the reactions are amazing. Here, I think I was given closure, seeing that all the media treat the article and treat it as something of a thank you for putting a number on it. Thank you for saying that there were many cases and that it was a pattern. Thank you for giving it a title, which suggests maybe there is something organized logic behind it, that this is not some isolated act of some person acting on his own initiative. Thank you for putting out this lying propaganda. Thank you. Times staffers who, thank you for putting it into the international lexicon. Thank you for putting out in the international ether so that we can all just continue to clap for your lies. Times staffers who spoke to The Intercept on the condition of anonymity for fear of professional reprisal described the Screams Without Words article as the product of the same mistakes that led to the disastrous editor's note and retraction on the Rukmini Kalmachi's podcast Caliphate and print series on the Islamic State group. Khan, the current executive editor, was widely known as a promoter and protector of Kalamachi. The reporting, which the Times determined to be an internal review, was not subject to sufficient scrutiny by top editors and fell short of the paper's standards. On ensuring accuracy, had been a finalist for a 2019 Pulitzer Prize. That honor, along with other prestigious awards, was rescinded in the wake of the scandal. Yeah, but this scandal literally is so much worse. Like, there needs to be multiple reports on the insanity of this. Seriously, there needs to be a book. There needs to be a documentary. Margaret Sullivan, the last public editor for the New York Times to serve a full term before the paper discarded the position in 2017, said that she hopes that such an investigation will be launched into the Screams Without Words story. I sometimes joke, it's another good day not to be the New York Times public editor, but the organization could really use one right now to investigate on behalf of readers, she wrote. At some story meeting, Schwartz said on the Channel 12 podcast, guests with Middle East expertise were there to offer probing questions. We had a weekly meeting and you bring out the status of your work on your project, she said, and Times writers and guests who were concerned with Middle Eastern affairs coming from all kinds of places in the world. They would ask you questions and challenge you, and it's excellent that they do that because you yourself all the time, you don't believe yourself for a moment. I like how she acts like there was all this rigorous fact checking and reporting and this. I said rigoring. Rigorous fact check and reporting on everything. But I like how she acts like there was all this rigorous reporting and it wasn't just trust me, bro. I like how she acts like there was all this rigorous reporting. She keeps bragging about it like, oh yeah, we were really getting into it, challenging ourselves, except you weren't. And that's what came out of this. Those questions were challenging to answer, she said. One of the questions you get asked, and it's the hardest one to not be able to answer, is if this happened in so many places, how can it be that there's no forensic evidence? How can it be that there is no documentation? How can it be that there are no records, a report, an Excel spreadsheet? You're telling me about Shari Mendez. That's someone who said she saw it with her own eyes and is now speaking to you. Is there no written report that'll make you what she's saying authoritative? Well, considering she wasn't an expert and she was claiming and talking about it like she was a forensic expert, yeah. So basically what she's saying is, are you telling me that you just don't trust our propagandists who work for the government? Are you telling me that you want some evidence? Some evidence? You're just not going to trust what the people who work for the government say, bro? There was nothing, Schwartz said. She was told there was no collection of evidence from the scene. Nothing. Nothing. But broadly, she said, the editors were fully behind the project. So there was no evidence. Nothing. But they were fully behind the project. The editors were fully behind the project, despite the fact that there was no evidence. Why? Because some Israeli hack who works for the fucking authorities said so, which tells me, again, There was clearly an agenda. The New York Times wanted this to be a thing. There was no evidence. They knew there was no evidence, but they put it out anyway because they wanted it to be seen by the international community. A Times spokesperson pointed to the portion of the interview as evidence of the paper's rigorous process. LOL. We have reviewed the wider transcripts, and it's clear you're persisting in taking quotes out of context. In the portion of the interview you refer to, Anat describes being encouraged by editors to corroborate evidence and sources before we publish the investigation. Later, she discusses regular meetings with editors where they would ask hard and challenging questions, and then the time it took to undertake the second and third stage of sourcing. What second and third stage of sourcing? What? Like, it's embarrassing all these people that are trying to defend it. Like, just take the L, bro. We know you're fucking lying. This is all part of a rigorous... Please stop saying rigorous reporting. This is, like, so embarrassing for you guys. Rigorous? Like, we just went through all the bullshit that you guys didn't do. Oh, my gosh. And of which we continue to stand behind. We stand behind our made-up shit. In her interview with the Channel 12 podcast, Schwartz said that she began working with Gettleman soon after October 7th. My job was to help him spread this propaganda. My job was to help him spread this propaganda, you know? He had all kinds of thoughts about things, about articles he wanted to do. She recalled on the first day, there were already 3 things on his lineup. And then I saw that there was a number 3 with sexual violence. Schwartz said that in this initial aftermath of October 7th attacks, there was not much focus on sexual assaults. But by the time she began working for Gettleman, rumors began spreading that such acts had taken place, most of it based on the commentary of Zaka and workers and the IDF officials and soldiers. Okay. After the article was published, Gettleman was invited to speak on a panel about sexual violence at Columbia University School of International Public Affairs. Embarrassing. Embarrassing. So while you guys are all crying about Columbia being anti-Semitic because they have pro-Palestine groups, you're inviting a full-on liar propagandist to come in and spread further lies and speak on sexual violence on your panels. Like, get the fuck out of here. Like, this is so embarrassing. On public affairs, his efforts were lauded on the panel by and its host, Sandberg, the former Facebook executive. Oh, I guess she doesn't work there anymore. Instead of doubling down on the reporting that helped win the Times, a prestigious poke award, Gettleman dismissed the need for reporters to provide evidence. That's just amazing. No. We don't need to provide evidence. We're just journalists and reporters. What we found, I don't want to even use the word evidence because evidence is almost like a legal term. No, it's not. Except it's not. Trying to prove an allegation or prove a case in court, Gettleman told Sandberg, that's not my role. You know, we all have our roles, and my role is to document, to present information, and to give people a voice. Bro, you forgot the precursor to that. Your role is to document, present information, and to give people a voice using evidence. Using evidence. Like, this is just fucking crazy. And we found information along the entire chain of violence, of sexual violence. Like, I just love that he admits that he doesn't have any evidence and didn't need any. Gettleman said his mission was to move people. Okay, so he's straight up admitting that his mission was to do propaganda and to manipulate people's emotions. Like, literally admitting it. My goal and my job is not to provide evidence, which is why people fucking read the news, okay? That's why people fucking read it. So that you can move people and give evidence to the information that you are presenting. But he's like, no. My job is to just manipulate people's emotions with propaganda, you know? Get the information and then to shape it. Well, thank you for admitting that, he said. That's our job as journalists. Again, no, it's not. Your job is to fucking challenge power and to uncover the truth and then convey those stories using fucking evidence. This is crazy. Like, we need to fucking the so-called journalism industrial complex is so out of control in this country, like, it needs serious reform. To get information, the story that's our job as journalists, to get the information and to share the story in a way that makes people care, not just to inform, but to move people. Again, yes, it is to move people and to get people to care using evidence. And that's what I've been doing for a long time. Shut the fuck up. He should be fired. Not just the psychotic, genocidal, fucking anti-Palestinian lunatic. Not just that woman. He should be fucking fired. One Times reporter said colleagues are wondering what a balanced approach might look like. I am waiting to see if the paper will report in depth, deploying the same kind of resources and means on the United Nations report that documented the horrors committed against Palestinian women. I am waiting to see if the paper will report in depth, deploying the same kind of resources and means on the United Nations report that documented the horrors committed against Palestinian women. Yeah, where are you guys at? Where are you guys at? Because there is a report from the UN documenting human rights violations against Palestinian women and girls. Where are you guys at, Times? There's a lot of reporting. Where are you guys at? The UN released this report on February 19th. I haven't heard anything from the Times. You guys looking into that? It's almost like you don't want to talk about sexual violence against Palestinian women and girls, and that you want to make up shit about what happened on October 7th as a means to continue to justify the dehumanization of the Palestinian people and their murder. It's almost like that. You guys, this whole thing was a systemic hoax. All of it. You guys, this whole thing. You guys, when I first heard of the beheaded babies hoax early on and the lies about like a woman having a baby cut out of her and stuff, initially I believed it. I was like, oh my gosh, like, and I assumed that evidence would be forthcoming. I obviously learned rather quickly that they were making it up and that I obviously learned rather quickly that there was no evidence forthcoming, that it never did come, and it was a lie. And it was just made up. Like, they literally just made this up. They manufactured this entire women mass rape, beheaded babies hoax. The whole thing was made up and manufactured as a way to manufacture consent. They wanted to manufacture consent amongst Americans and the international community so that they could justify slaughtering Palestinians in mass. Just like they manufactured the UNRWA hoax so that they could starve Palestinians in mass. All of it is a fucking lie. I'll be following what happens going forward. Because as of right now, the Times just keeps saying, we stand by our reporting. We stand by our reporting. Do you? Okay, we'll see. We're going to see how this develops. I want to see what comes out of that so-called investigation of Anat Schwartz. I want to see what happens to Jeffrey Gettleman. I will be continuing to follow this. But I hope that if you happen to come across this, and you don't really know that much about it, I hope that you approach this with an open mind, share it for people that may be still in the dark about it, and really consider it. Because again, I understand the kind of knee-jerk reaction to believe stuff when you hear it like that, because it is horrible. And I did initially believe it. And one of the reasons why I initially believed it is because I thought, what kind of monster would make something like that up? Like, if you're going to make a claim like that, you're going to have evidence for that. That's really horrific. But there isn't evidence for it. And so I understand the like kind of knee-jerk reaction of believing something like that and just being shocked into horror. But you guys, you got to look deeper. You've got to look deeper because they lied. And they lied so that they could continue to ethnically cleanse and carry out a genocide on the Palestinian people without any consequence. Thanks for joining me for this. If you haven't already, subscribe. You can follow me on TikTok, on Twitter at @IamBlakely_ on Twitter and Instagram. And yeah, I hope that I know that that was long, but I think that going through these things in detail is really important so that we can collectively push back on their lies. Free Palestine as always. See you guys later.